And I was just going to start by introducing myself and explaining why I'm interested in this topic and why I think it's relevant to anarchism, and then to talk a little about what the commons are, more importantly what they're not, and then look at some examples of traditional commons and new commons that are emerging. And that's really the reason I think this is an important topic. It draws from my background. In quite a while ago now, I was involved in some long-term academic research with indigenous resource users in Amazonia, and that gave me the opportunity to look in quite considerable depth at the ways they managed to self-organise in order to create their livelihoods from the resources under their control. And that gave me quite a rich understanding of the importance in organising outside state and markets without any top-down intervention, of common property systems, the different ways around the world where people come together to create their own systems for regulating access to resources in which they've got a common interest, but reflect the subtle details and differences in the social and ecological realities around the world. Since I did that, I've got much more deeply involved in movements that are seeking, often from an ecological point of view, to create alternatives to the unsustainable society we have, and especially grassroots movements like permaculture, eco-villages, transition. I'm not going to talk that much about transition itself. With those of you who are in here the last night, I've had a very great exposition from Peter about what transition's about, what it involves. What all these movements have in common is a recognition that sustainability is incompatible with the basic premises of hierarchical top-down societies, and that we need to self-organise and work together to create alternatives. To me, sustainability implies anarchism. Anarchism implies sustainability, because if we don't have control of the material basis for our lives, if we're not capable of self-organising to ensure that that material basis is sustained in the long run, we don't have the basis for any society. And if we're not capable of demonstrating that we are capable of answering those questions ourselves, we've got no strong case for opposing the status quo and for those systems, those groups that maintain power largely through controlling our access to resources. So, yeah, that's why I think that's where I'm coming from in this topic, that's why I think it's relevant here. To talk about what commons are about, first, I might try by sharing some of our own experiences and interests, and just giving everyone an opportunity to share those and then talk those out loud. So I'm going to invite you to just have a quick conversation with the person next to you. So find a friend, someone to talk to. You may want to talk across rows if you can't find somebody. And just for a couple of minutes, each answer the question, what do you understand by the commons, what do they mean to you, and then after that you'll have the opportunity, if you want, to sort of shout out and say what you think. So go ahead and start your conversation. Raise your hand if you've got no one to talk to.
I just saw going against
Okay, so let's hear what anyone's got to say. So, what are the commons? Points? What do you think of it?
We were discussing the fact that once upon a time commons was the land where people who were travelling through could actually use. The councils were obliged by law to actually provide it to people, but those commons seem to be on the dwindle. But we actually mentioned it whether or not that's still functioning as a place where people work up to stay the night.
And they involve permission, I heard in there, for access.
Nothing we were just talking about, but I was once given an original Act of Parliament, which was an enclosure Act of Parliament, which related to the area where I used to live in Wiltshire. And what I realised from this Act of Parliament was that all the land around where I used to live used to be common land, and it's now all owned by very wealthy people in that part of Wiltshire. And so there was this whole thing about property and theft, you know, that actually all of that land that should have belonged to the people who lived in that area had been stolen from them and given to wealthy people who were able to add to their wealth as a result of that. And there was that Act of Parliament, so the wealthy people who were the MPs in Parliament were able to basically give the land to themselves. So that notion of theft seemed to be really important.
Yeah, and there's a clear element of the commons there. It's about ownership.
Absolutely.
Who has ownership? Who can make decisions? Who controls access?
I've been reading a book about the Greek crisis in 2008, the protests there, and one chapter talks about what's being left in the commons, in the realm of the commons. And it says that one of the things that was left in the realm of the commons is debt, national debt.
Great. Ah, thank you.
Nationalisation of the debt.
Yeah.
Everything else is taken away.
Absolutely.
Water, private.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing two important sides of the process here. We talk about enclosure, and historically there's been a trajectory where a great many resources that were held in common are now controlled either by the state or increasingly by private interests, and often operated by the state on behalf of private interests. And the need for private ownership to be supported by the common good, which has always been true, but we saw in the reaction to the banking crisis, the immediate response was to return to the Commonwealth to bail out and to support it. And again, the debt thing the system needs to prop itself up is retained because nobody wants it. Any more key points from those conversations?
We were discussing about new terminologies, new definition of commons, so kind of open source hardware or softwares, which are kind of new frontier commons, or the patent copyright issues.
So again, the copyright refers to ownership and position. The open source refers to an important point that Peter made a few earlier here. There was talk about transition earlier and how you relate issues of power that inevitably arise to anarchist values, and the solution they're using is transparency. You make that power transparent, visible and accountable, which is what the open source movement does by showing its working processes and making them available to people. So, technically, when we talk about commons, I'll move to a new sheet. I see there as being three main elements to any common property regime. First of all, you have resources. They're often land or other material goods. They may also be intellectual and more cultural, as we talk about with open source materials. You have a group of people who are the co-users of these resources. So these resources need to be materially important to people. They need to be potentially a scarce supply, because there's no point in regulating access. And the people need to have ownership and decision-making authority and power. They need not only to own the resource, but also to be able to make decisions about how it's allocated. And the crucial thing that links these two, existence of some sort of management regime, some set of rules and regulations about who can access the resource, so who these people are, how they operate together, what their rights and responsibilities are in terms of the use of resource. That needs some sort of regulatory mechanisms. So the people need to be able to monitor compliance with the rules and regulations, and they also need to be able to enforce the rules. There needs to be some sort of system for sanctions against those who don't play by the rules. This regime has to fit the capacity, it has to be viable, has to be consistent with the capacity of this group of care users, this community of users around the resource house. And it also has to be meaningful culturally and socially. It has to make sense to people. People have to be able to understand rules and have to be able to understand the processes. It also has to be realistic in terms of the resources. It's on this side we're seeing it needs to have social meaning in it. It also needs to be ecologically realistic if we're talking about material resources. So you need the right sets of rules and regulations to enable these resources to be sustained. They need to be consistent with the ecological reality, the regenerative capacity, the limits. And it also needs to be responsive to changes in the availability of resources. There need to be feedbacks of words. So there needs to be ways where people can, the co-users can, through the management regime, take stock of declines or other changes in the resource base, change the way they're operating, and feed that back in to how they operate and the ways they make decisions. And it's this set of informal institutions, this comprise the management regime, that link the people with the resources, and the fact that this is self-organised, these rules are made, they're regulated, they're enforced, and they're monitored and changed by the people, is what makes the commons a source of self-governance, a source of empowerment. And globally, commons have been the ways that people have self-organised for resource use throughout most of human history. The dominance of private ownership, and top-down regulation is, in historical terms, an anomaly. It's a relatively recent phenomenon historically that's only since the spread of capitalism spread over the globe and become the dominant form of ownership and management. Any questions or points on that before we move on? Yeah, it should be at one scale that the management regime has to be aware of what people are doing and if people are following the rules. It also has to be aware of if the rules are working, so feedbacks from the environment and from the user group. So it's creating a form of communication of social and collective communication between people and the resources that give the scope for individuals or individual groups of users to make their decisions in ways which comply with the greater social good and the need in the long term to sustain, even enhance the resource base, because they're built into the management regime.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about what you mean by meaningful? Does that mean owned by the people as well? The management regime should be agreed and owned by people. Is that what you mean?
That's part of it. It's we're talking about self-organising, self-governing groups of users. Meaningful, I'm talking about largely in a cultural sense. Often a lot of these rules and regulations are encoded in religion or other customary forms, so you don't have these abstract sets of rules. Example, one of the great historical commons that's still active is this intricate network of irrigation pipelines in Bali that water all the rice paddies over the whole island, and there's no explicit set of rules about how this water is allocated. There's a network of water temples that prescribe certain ritual prescriptions. People have to engage with the temples in certain ways, and the temples are also the sites where the flow of water through different parts of the system is regulated, and the priesthood there is actually fulfill a really important ecological function in terms of making sure that this water is allocated fairly and in ways that could also support pest control, for example. The flows of water meant that the patterns at which rice was maturing in different patterns, in different paddies and groups of paddies, was such that made it most difficult when there was a pest infestation in one area for it to get across to other areas, for example. Nobody actually knew that intellectually, but it was all encoded so effectively in the religion. In fact, when the Indonesian government tried to chuck out all the temples and sort of introduce a high-tech sort of computer-operated system, they just couldn't do it. It was just too complicated. I want to talk about what commons aren't, and how many of you heard of the tragedy of the commons? Hopefully quite a few. Anyone feel like explaining it? It was, I'll do that. Feel free to butt in if you've got anything to add. There's a guy called Garrett Hardin produced a really famous paper in Science, the scientific journal, in 1969 about the tragedy of the commons, it's become the dominant cultural narrative on the commons, despite actually being fundamentally untrue, which tells you a lot about the politics of commons. And the example he used was a grazing land held in common, and so you have anybody is allowed to graze the cattle on this commons, and up to a point you fill the grazing with a certain number of cattle, and everybody's doing better. Everybody who raises a cow, for example, on that, they get the benefit of the cow. Once you reach the carrying capacity of the particular grazing area, every additional animal that's put on it reduces the quality of the grazing for all of them. So you're getting less return for each animal. But for an individual following their own rational economic self-interest, they get the full benefit of putting an extra cow on, but the disadvantage is shared across all of them, so they get more from the single extra cow than they do from the overall decline in the grazing. And interestingly, we can go into the ecological economics of it if you want to go into that much detail. What's quite bizarre about that is that marginal advantage to the individual continues however overgrazed the pasture is, and up to the point where it's entirely degraded. So if all the co-users of a resource that's not subject to any regulation follow their rational self-interest, the outcome is one that's completely disadvantaged to everybody because you've got a degraded pasture above a resource that's no use to anybody. There's no incentive for individuals to, if you take your cows off, if you do the right thing, the socially responsible thing, then somebody else is putting extra cattle on and you're still incurring the disadvantage. So there's a sort of race to the bottom of the type that we see in predatory capitalism and its relation to resources worldwide. I should go back to this. Anybody see what's wrong with that argument?
I read an article in The Land saying that he actually refuted that himself, but no one ever talks about that. Basically because it's not managed, it's this assumption that people just act as individuals, whereas actually what actually happens is that people organise, they get together and say, you know, we should do this as a group. People don't act as a group.
That argument, and yes, you're entirely correct. A few years later, Harding published a retraction which is lost in history. It's only people who studied this literature who know about it. It was a few years after the original Tragedy of the Commons article, Harding published a retraction, and he said that what he should actually have referred to is the tragedy of the unmanaged commons. So that original argument ignored the existence of these management regimes and ignored the fact you don't actually get unregulated commons in any situation where people rely on a particular resource for their livelihood and they're using it at a level that could threaten its integrity, because if that's happened, people have died out or had to change their livelihood or had to move on. When we look at any society that has a historically long-term relationship with a particular set of resources, they're only been able to persist because they have in place some sort of management regime, some sort of often very sophisticated set of methods which articulate between their needs and the capacity and the properties of the natural environment. But this argument about the tragedy of the commons has been it's still very prominent in popular culture. It's still very prominent in discussions over ownership. Can anyone suggest why? Why everybody leapt on the first observation, but not the correction? Yeah, you look like you're keen to say something.
I mean, it's in the interest of the powers that be, isn't it, that people that myth persists.
Yeah.
So you hear it. I mean, it's everywhere. It's like you say, it's the dominant cultural narrative.
Yeah. So if these management regimes don't exist, then first of all, that's a justification for access to these resources, and the history of enclosure is the history of elites taking control of resources for themselves. That's something that started several hundred years ago here. It's not ancient history, it's something that's still continuing as indigenous peoples worldwide. There's, I think about 60% of Africa remains under customary systems of ownership and regulation and management, and that's continually being undermined and threatened by land grabs, by increased privatisation or state appropriation of land. Conservation has in the past 20 years or so become an increasingly important part of that. Again, the narrative that you have a set of people who aren't capable of taking responsibility for the sustainable use of the resources. You can only make that argument by ignoring the existence of that management regime or by undermining it. So once you either willfully ignore or destroy that management regime, once you have access to the resources, you also have access to the people, which was the other important dynamic of enclosure, was to undermine people's self-reliance and create captive labour markets for the increased industrialisation in cities, the sort of land grabs and assaults on indigenous land rights tend to be more about resources still these days. Often have been even in the 1970s, the Brazilian government was still referring to Amazonia as terra nullius, an empty land, land without people, or people without land. There were other, it's also often used as a way to compel people to participate in privatised and capitalist modes of production. Okay. Do we have any questions on this before we move on to talking about examples of commons? I'll talk very briefly about the management regimes of the people that I was working with in 1998 and 2000. A group of indigenous resource users called the Wapishana in southwest Guyana. They live on a savanna. They live in quite small hamlets that tend to be extended families on a large area of open savanna next to forests, which are the main places where they cut farms and they hunt and they fish. Their economy is still almost entirely based on subsistence and self-organised, and they, because of the nature of indigenous land title in Guyana, they're allocated a reserve by the government over which they have complete control over resource use decisions and resource allocation. So this whole sort of broad area of land is owned by the community, owned by the villagers, and individual ownership accrues when somebody decides to make a farm. They use long fallow swidden agriculture, which is where someone clears a small plot, burns it, plants crops in the space and farms it for a year or two until the forest takes over, which at appropriate densities actually enhances the ecological richness and biodiversity in the place. So somebody will cut a line into the forest, make their farm there, every year they'll make another farm, and gradually they'll create a mosaic of active farms that are regrown, where people often go back to gather materials, and there's often a lot of hunting there because the old farms are very attractive to a lot of the most important species of wildlife people hunt. The rights are allocated in what you call a usufruct fashion, that you assert individual ownership by making use of it. So once this line's cut, it requires other people can use it if they get permission of the first people to cut it. So it's to somebody's advantage to have other people around. There's lots of heavy work where people need to get together in groups to get the job done. So up to a point, this person's always going to say, yes, come along, join me. At the point at which it starts to get too crowded, people have to go too far to find good land, there's no space for expansion, they'll start to say no, so another person has to go off and do the same thing. And so there are several distinct farming areas, each operated by a small network of usually closely related people. And individuals maintain rights. So once somebody's cut a farm, then they're the only person who can go back and cut a new farm there. So that means that the need for quite a long time interval, usually about 15 or 20 years between putting a farm in one place and going back to it, which is necessary for the system to function well ecologically, for the farm to regrow. That because people have individual ownership for as long as they're still using it, then that allows that to operate. And on a broader scale, this distributes people across the landscape in a way which gets the optimum balance between accessibility and still maintaining intact patches of forest and not over-farming any of the land beyond its optimum. Often people also have longer lines to go along into the forest to go hunting, and often to the fishing grounds on a major river which is about 15 miles from the village. Again, there's a similar system of self-regulation where somebody historically has made the first line, created the first fishing camp and then that's extended through permission to a number of co-users up to the point where the benefits of association and of having more people coming along that line by having people to go hunting with together, by spreading information. People are constantly talking about where the animals are moving, what's happening, what the conditions. So when those benefits of socialisation up to the point at which they outweigh the ecological impacts of there being too much hunting pressure, people will give permission. Once it gets beyond that, then again somebody has to go off and do their own thing. So, nobody really talks explicitly about the ecological roles of this. Sometimes people who are really clued up about the ecology there, you talk it through with them, they'll explain how it works in that way, but normally the reasons why people do it are because of custom and tradition, or that's just the way things are done. And there also, I won't go into them, there are certain religious prescriptions that support it and regulate how people actually work along their lines. And there's constant monitoring. People can see, they're constantly observing the ecology. They can see if an area is overfarmed, they can see if it's overhunted or overfished, because the depletion's very observable to them. The sanctions are largely social, so if you don't go along with this, then there's a risk that you'd be socially isolated from the village. Your permission to take use of this general resource could be withdrawn, or less low-key people simply stop doing things with you, simply stop joining in, so you don't get the benefits of sociality, of living together, and the practical benefits of needing hunting partners, people to help out on the farm. The final important element of these mechanisms, that of feedback, is collective feedback of if it's working. One village, not one, was mostly working, and one next door. I had the situation where, because people didn't want to go as far into the forest to farm, all the good land close to the village was being used up, so they had to introduce a new system where people were just, again, it was held in common, but every family was just allocated a patch of land. So again, the system was flexible enough because it's ecologically responsive. They're ecological feedbacks, they're social feedbacks, because those people who didn't have access to farmland are part of the community of users that could feed into decision making and the process that examined how these rules were made. And that allowed it to be flexible and responsive to when changes in the social situation and people's aspiration change the balance between the social conditions and the ecology.
Can I ask you a question? You used in your previous diagram the thing about management systems.
Yeah.
And whenever I hear the word, as somebody who works in the public sector, whenever I hear the word management, I always think management is the enemy of the work that I do. But you're talking about something which is not kind of authoritarian, it's not top-down, it's much more intuitive. Is this what you're saying? In that example?
It's self-management.
Self-regulating.
What's inherent about commons is that it's this group of co-users who whose shared interest is in reliance on these resources, they're the same people who are operating the management regime that's open to everybody.
So in your example, they didn't have any rules written down or anything, it was more kind of intuitive within them?
Yeah, more customary. Everybody knew the rules and was socialised into them. You simply wouldn't, it was probably unthinkable to sort of form and do stuff in any other way, and they're also formal, well, still informal, but still more collective sanctions if people didn't comply. It was disapproved of to the extent that people wouldn't want to anything to do with it. Okay, so we've got 20 minutes left. Any further questions at this point? Go into discussion. What I intended to do now was to talk about some new forms of emergent commons regimes that are taking some of the principles of this and applying them to the issues of how we assert control of resources in a post-capitalist context, or in efforts to construct alternatives. James, you want to say something?
I was just wondering, how are you telling us this as a sort of academic background, as to now you're going to explain how we can do it around us now?
Yeah, that's a suggestion.
That's what I'd like to hear from you.
So, the basic premise that we started with, the basic argument, is that a lot of activist and emancipatory movements have rediscovered the commons as alternatives to the state and capitalism. It's something that's been very prominent in Occupy since it moved from being a protest movement to discussion about practical alternative. Transition in my analysis and that of a lot of other people is about building common property regimes. Again, if you're here for Peter's talk, he was talking about how transition is in response to inaction of the dominant system, literally over climate change and peak oil, and the observation that actually the dominant system has too much interest in the causes of these issues to be able to create alternative. Practically, we found that the only way to address them is to come together as communities and self-organise in order to investigate, well, how do we provide our means in the light of the changes that are happening, the need to move away from dependency on inherently unsustainable systems of providing our basic needs, because they're causing environmental damage, because they're relying on scarce resources. So anybody think of any examples of these?
CSAs, community support agriculture.
Land co-ops would be another related example.
This garden we're in now.
Sorry?
This garden we're in now.
Any others?
Shared allotments.
Moving on from land, anything else?
Cooperatives, workers' cooperatives, housing cooperatives, community cooperatives, financial cooperatives, media cooperatives.
But workers' co-ops are sort of a general one. Financial co-ops, what were you talking about really there?
Oh yeah, I've heard of financial co-ops.
Linked to that here, the Bristol Pound is a conscious effort in
I dispute the Bristol Pound is actually about commons. I say the Bristol Pound is the interest of merchants. They have a secondary investment system for merchants, but they don't have a secondary investment system for people to people.
Okay, well, we'll question. We won't get into that now. So I think it's a very good point. I think that one of the aspirations behind the Bristol pound is to democratise ownership of the money supply. There's clearly a tension there between its need to work with traders who are very much embedded in the private system and maybe don't have strong interest in moving away from that. So the aspirational and many other complementary currencies.
Next currencies, street bank, free gold, free cycle.
I've got a big one that's missing for me there is energy co-ops. And other community energy schemes. Anybody got anything else to add?
Yeah,
That's I don't know personally about the sort of the ownership and decision making structures there, but I understand that you know.
Well, I thought that it's like a bit of land that like everyone owns and everyone works a different bit, and like they always school together and each teach each other each other.
And that's a really example of way of again assuming that they do have this inclusion and democracy in the decision making of creating commons around all the basic essential elements of life. Also moving away from resources. Somebody mentioned open source technology. Wikipedia is another example of cultural commons where information and control over production and exchange of information is the key currency. That's right.
The apothecary at Cavelli.
Yeah. And that's
Like a health collective.
and that's interesting. Again, it's both the physical resources there, the medicinal herbs, and so plus access to the knowledge. Is it witches in tracksuits? A group of herbalists who offer free advice and guidance to people on how to use the resources. So again, it's a good example of how commons aren't just about physical access to resources, it's also very much the individual and cultural capabilities to regulate and manage them. As an example of, and just the generic example, I'd quite like to talk about energy co-ops and community energy. So we have a situation where we typically everybody living lifestyles like ours is dependent on access to electricity and other forms of refined energy. This comes to our house through local distribution grids, through broad-scale transmission systems, through power stations that are fueled by almost entirely, still 90% of energy traded on world markets comes from fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, uranium, and these our only connection. All of these energy flows through the system this way from its primary source to its end point of end use. Money is extracted by usually various corporate interests to simplify. The only information that we get directly as end users is, does the light come on when we turn on the switch? Are we connected to this, and is it all working? And then when our bill comes, the only feedback between end users, and the actual, all of this regulation and operation is the bills that we pay, whether someone's capable of paying or not. And to a small extent, the government control in this country through Ofgem is supposedly answerable to consumers. So this makes us, in a way that's invisible, unless we take the effort to inform ourselves, culpable in climate change, in the entrenched power of a lot of the oil companies or the fossil fuel companies, to resource scarcity, to environmental disasters, as we've seen, to the whole enterprise of fracking, which, again, as Pete said, we're all culpable in that because we're all, at the end of it, using this energy and it's all supporting our lifestyles. It's easy for us to forget about that if we choose to. It's also very difficult for us to do anything about that because we're so isolated from all of that. So there's a massive gap between the public will and any desire for change, all the negative consequences and feedback processes that could affect how these operations take place. The solution to this is, as people are experimenting with here in Bristol and many other places, to first of all, renewable energy is one way to eliminate dependencies, the direct dependencies on some of these environmental damaging sources, and reducing the externalities. It's, again, the uptake's been slow and insufficient so far by the corporate sector because it's largely been driven by profit motives, waiting for the balance between the revenues from these sources to put the revenues from these. And it's gone far beyond the environmental need for action and the political, and it's lagged far behind and political and public will. So just substituting these without changing any of this structure is an end-of-pipe solution that's dealing with some of these problems, not all of them, and particularly not addressing the power imbalances in the system and the disempowerment of end users. Well, if production, if ownership of the energy generating technology goes into the hands of the users, as is happening with some community energy schemes, then that's allowing some decision making over what types of technologies, what types of energy production we invest in use. It's not, again, so it's maybe eliminating some of this. Generally, they're all connected to the grid. The energy's sold to one of these companies. So there's a payoff and there's some element of revenues being returned in local circulation. This whole logic of the grid, the lack of feedback, so the lack of direct connection and responsibility isn't challenged unless people close the loop by taking control immediately of the sale as well as the distribution as well as the generation by community-owned energy trading companies that operate local networks. And this is a suggestion that Trevor Houghton made, I remember him making a few years ago to a lot of the academics that work on these issues, and sort of terrified them with the idea that communities en masse would take control of their own energy supplies. And so there are only two examples I know of where this has really happened, where you have an energy commons where the generating infrastructure, the distribution and the circulation, the whole management of the system is under the control of the end users. One is in the Scottish island of Egg, in the Outer Hebrides, which they didn't really have any options. They're so remote, they're not connected to the national grid, it'd be far too expensive. They used to run largely off generators, but not so long ago they shifted to a system that provides all of their energy needs through a combination of hydro, wind and solar that's all generated on the island, and have their own enterprise that operates that infrastructure on behalf of the community. When you're reliant on on-site renewables, then there's a limit to how much you can use, so there's a need for regulation, and again, that's part of the disempowerment. Load balancing is the responsibility of the generation and the transition companies. In Egg, they don't have that option. They introduced a system whereby they decided on a limit on the amount of electricity any household could use on one time as their basic regulatory mechanism. What happens if you go over that is you trip the network for the whole island. Not just your power goes off, everyone's power goes off. Everybody knows it was you, and that's an example. It's quite a crude one so far, but it's a meaningful one, I think, because it's so different from what we have and what we're used to, of how we can create those feedbacks, and resource users who are also resource managers can come together to make quite innovative and novel decisions about how to regulate it. Probably a more radical example, there's an eco-village in eastern Germany called Siebenlinden, which is in control of most of its own energy supply. It has an on-site solar array, which is still connected to the grid and they're still not self-sufficient, but what's important is they only have a single point of contact to the national grid. They operate their own distribution network within the village where they make decisions about how they pay for it as a village, and internally they decide how the responsibilities and the need to pay is allocated among people. They also are self-sufficient in terms of heating from woodlands that grow on site. They have a flat rate. Every adult resident in the village pays a certain amount to the cooperative that runs it every month, and that gives them, among other things, rights to all the electricity they need, all the heating fuel they need, and they rely on there being a shared ethic of sustainability and frugality, and people aren't going to use energy excessively. They've got very energy efficient houses, for example, and people are there's a great deal of self-regulation. They do monitor, every house is metered, so they do monitor individuals' use just to see how things are going, and there's one time they noticed that there was one guy who was using 10 times as much electricity as anybody else, and that's a point at which the system starts to break down a little. I mean, the one thing I didn't mention is that there's a flat rate per adult, so the cost of children is socialised. Most households with children are probably using a bit more energy, there are more people in different demands, but all adults in the village share that cost. This particular guy, there was talk of, do we need to do something? Do we need to limit his consumption? Do we need to charge him more? But when they looked into it, they realised the reason that he was using so much electricity was because he'd withdrawn socially from the village. He was just sitting in his house every night watching TV, which nobody did, running up this huge electricity consumption, and they decided that actually that was a social problem. There was some way in which they as a community weren't addressing his social needs. So the way they operate their energy system allowed them to use that as an indicator for a deeper social problem in a way that isn't possible when we're so disconnected from our use of resources, our control of them, and the consequences of that. So they're just tiny examples, and we're only starting out on all of this, of how by emulating the ways in which historically all peoples self-organised around resource use and allocation, and in the present day many people still do, and those people who do are still fighting to hold on to that. How that gives an example of the types of creative ways that we might start to come together and self-organise around all sorts of issues, all sorts of problems, and really empower ourselves in deep ways around the new societies we're seeking to build.